On the morning of April 25, 1897, the machine shop on the edge of Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, was already ash by the time the townspeople reached it. The wooden building had gone up fast. What burned inside it could not be bought back with insurance money, because the most valuable things in a machine tool works are not the machines. They are the wooden foundry patterns and the paper drawings, the accumulated knowledge of how every part is shaped and poured and finished. All of it was gone. Two brothers stood in front of the smoking foundation with no capital, no patterns, and a grinding machine that the rest of the country had only just begun to understand it needed. 4 days later, the company was worth $100,000, and it had a new name. The men who put up the money were not investors from New York or Philadelphia. They were the brothers' neighbors. Welcome back to Trade Archive. The story starts on a farm on Antietam Creek, a few miles south of Waynesboro, in the middle of the 19th century. That is where Abraham Landis grew up, in a family that had come to Franklin County from the Pennsylvania Dutch country around Lancaster. His father died when Abraham was barely a year old. He learned the machinist's trade the way most men did then, in a shop, with his hands, under the eye of his older brothers. One of those brothers, Franklin, was the kind of mechanic other mechanics talked about. He could look at a problem in iron and see the answer before he picked up a tool. In the 1870s, Franklin and Abraham went into business together. They built steam engines. Portable ones, the sort a farmer could haul from field to field to drive a thresher or a sawmill. It was good work, and they were good at it. But being good at the work and being good at business are two different things, and the brothers were about to learn the difference the hard way. By 1878, the money ran out. They had no capital to carry them through a slow season, and a slow season came. So they sold everything: the engines, the patterns, the goodwill, the name. At the age when most men are building something, the Landis brothers were starting over with nothing. What saved them was the biggest company in town. Geiser Manufacturing built steam traction engines and threshing machines, and it dominated Waynesboro the way a single mill dominates a mill town. Geiser did not see two failed businessmen when it looked at the Landis brothers. It saw two of the finest mechanics in the county, going cheap. So it bought their assets and it hired them. Franklin took charge of design, where he drew up a traction engine called the Peerless that won a gold medal for fuel economy at a national exposition and became one of Geiser's flagship products. Abraham was made foreman of the engine department, and then, when the company opened a new tool department, they put him in charge of it. It was the pattern that would define the brothers' careers. Franklin drew the elegant thing. Abraham worked out how to make it, and the credit landed on the company that employed them. For men who had just been broke, steady work at the biggest firm in town was a trade worth making. That tool department is where the real story begins. Abraham kept running into the same wall. A steam engine needs shafts that are perfectly round and perfectly smooth, and the standard way to make them, on a lathe with a single cutting tool, could not hold the tolerance once the steel was hardened. The cutting tool chattered, and the finish was never good enough. So Abraham started building a different kind of machine, one that did not cut the metal at all. It held the workpiece between two centers, turned it slowly, and pressed a fast-spinning abrasive wheel against the surface, grinding the steel down in fractions the eye could not see. Grinding did what cutting never could. It worked on hardened steel, and it worked below the level of error a lathe could reach. By 1888, the machine was running on the Geiser factory floor, and the parts coming off it were rounder and smoother than anything a lathe could touch. Abraham patented the design under his own name, and that patent, sitting in the tool department of another man's company, was about to change both their lives. What Abraham had built was a universal cylindrical grinder, and the word universal was the boast. The same machine could grind a long, slender shaft or a short stub, an outside diameter, or, with the right attachment, the inside of a bore. None of it looked dramatic. A grinder does its work in a fine gray mist of spent abrasive and steel, quietly, in thousandths, and then 10,000ths, and the only proof that anything remarkable has happened is a shaft that comes off the center's rounder than the machine that made it had any right to produce. That was the machine the brothers bet the rest of their lives on. In January of 1890, the brothers walked out of Geiser to build the grinder for themselves. There was no dramatic rupture, no lawsuit filed on the courthouse steps. They simply understood what they were holding. Waynesboro now had two machine companies where it had one, and the town settled into a quiet rivalry, the old giant and the young shop started by the men the giant had rescued. The Landis brothers sold 6 grinders that first year. 6. In a town that measured its output in traction engines by the hundred, it looked like almost nothing. But every one of those 6 machines was a demonstration, sitting on a customer's floor, doing work that customer had been told could not be done. The men who took the risk on an unproven machine from an unknown shop became, without meaning to, the company's first salesmen. But the men who bought those 6 machines were the kind of customers who talked to one another. Word moved through the machine trade in the Northeast that there was a grinder coming out of a small Pennsylvania shop that held a finish nobody else could match. The orders came in slowly, then a little faster. The brothers poured everything back into the business, which meant they were always short of cash, and when the panic of 1893 swept the country and dragged half the machine trade under with it, Landis nearly went down a second time. They survived it. Barely. And they came out the other side with more orders than their little wooden shop could handle. Which is exactly where they were, stretched thin and finally growing. On the April morning, the shop burned to the ground. Now you know what those neighbors were looking at. Not a failed business. A proven one, at the worst possible moment, run by 2 men the town could not replace. The machinists Landis employed were among the highest-paid working men in Waynesboro, and the knowledge in those 2 heads was the reason the jobs existed at all. So the town did the math that no insurance company could. Local businessmen and ordinary residents put up the money themselves, and on April 29, 1897, 4 days after the fire, the partnership was incorporated as the Landis Tool Company, capitalized at $100,000. Ordinary people, shopkeepers and clerks and fellow machinists, chose to gamble their own savings on the belief that 2 brothers and a grinding machine were worth more to Waynesboro than that money was worth sitting in a bank. It was not charity. It was the soundest investment the town ever made. They rebuilt on the same ground, but this time in brick. Fireproof and laid out for real production. And the growth that followed was not gradual. Within a year, the company had to raise more capital. Within 5 years, the capitalization had climbed to $250,000, and Landis grinders were being crated up and shipped not only across the United States, but to England, Germany, France, and beyond. The company that had been ash in the spring of 1897 was, before the decade was out, selling into nearly every country where machines were built. The bond that formed that week, between a town and a factory it had literally paid to resurrect, would hold for more than 100 years. That is worth remembering because of how this story ends. By the turn of the century, Abraham Landis had another invention on his hands, a self-opening die head that cut clean threads onto bolts and pipe. But demand for grinders was so heavy that giving up floor space to make threading tools made no sense, so in 1903 the brothers spun the threading business off into a separate firm, the Landis Machine Company, which would run alongside the tool works in Waynesboro for generations. From that point on, the Landis Tool Company built one thing, and built it better than almost anyone alive: grinding machines. It is worth slowing down here to understand what that actually meant, because a Landis grinder was not one clever idea. It was a stack of them. Start with the bed, the great iron base that everything else sits on. In grinding, the enemy is vibration. A shutter too small to feel will print itself onto the workpiece as an error, and the entire point of the machine is to work below the level of error the eye can see. So Landis cast its beds heavy and deep, webbed on the inside with reinforcing ribs, so the iron would swallow vibration instead of passing it along. Those beds came out of the foundry as rough castings, and they were left to settle and stabilize before the real work began, because fresh iron moves as its internal stresses relax, and a bed that moves is a bed that lies to you. Then, once the casting was machined close, men finished the sliding surfaces by hand. Hand scraping is exactly what it sounds like. A craftsman shaves microscopic slivers of metal off the ways with a hand tool, checking the surface against a reference, again and again for hours, until the fit is truer than any machine of the day could grind it. A well-kept Landis could hold 2/10,000ths of an inch across its work. For scale, a sheet of paper is roughly 40 times thicker than that. The grinding wheel itself was its own science. It had to be hard enough to cut hardened steel and yet wear away at a controlled rate, shedding dull grains to expose fresh ones, so the cutting face renewed itself as it worked. Every material and finish called for a different wheel and a different set of speeds, and the men who ran Landis machines carried that knowledge in their hands and their ears. A good grinder hand could tell by the sound alone when a wheel was cutting clean and when it had started to rub. The machine gave you the precision. Reading it still took a craftsman. The most extreme work happened in one particular department, the one that built the high-speed spindles for internal grinding. Those spindles were designed to spin at tens of thousands of revolutions a minute, and at those speeds a single grain of dust caught in a bearing is not a nuisance. It is a death sentence for the part. So Landis ran that department like nothing else in the plant. The temperature was held steady. The machines were painted white. The men who assembled the spindles wore white, so that any speck of dirt would show itself against the cloth, and the air was kept as clean as the era knew how to keep it. This was decades before the semiconductor industry made the clean room famous. In a brick factory in rural Pennsylvania, Landis was already building one, because the physics gave them no choice. All of that precision was a solution waiting for its perfect problem. And at the turn of the century, the problem arrived. The automobile. An engine lives or dies on two parts that are miserable to make. The crankshaft, which turns the up and down punch of the pistons into the spin that drives the wheels. And the camshaft, whose egg-shaped lobes open and close the valves in exact time. Both are hardened steel. Both have surfaces that have to be ground to a tolerance measured in 10,000ths, or the engine tears itself apart. A lathe could not make these parts in any quantity. A Landis grinder could. The company built specialized crank grinders and cam grinders that carried a master pattern, so a worker could clamp a rough forged crankshaft into the machine and let it trace the master, grinding each offset pin round and true and identical to the last one that came off the line. The cam grinder was, if anything, the harder trick. A crank pin is round, just placed off-center. A cam lobe is not round at all. It is a carefully distorted egg, and every degree of its rotation has to be ground to a different radius, all of it hardened, all of it held to the same 10,000ths. Landis machines did it by riding the work against a master cam, a hardened template of the finished shape. So the grinding wheel rose and fell exactly as the master dictated, copying a perfect lobe onto every blank that came through. A camshaft carries a dozen of those lobes or more, each one timed to the others, and getting one wrong meant an engine that ran rough or did not run at all. The Landis cam grinder made that almost impossible, and it did it fast enough to keep an assembly line fed. That word, identical, is the one that mattered. When Henry Ford built the moving assembly line, the whole idea depended on interchangeable parts. A crankshaft from one bin had to drop into an engine from another bin with no hand fitting, no filing, no skilled fitter coaxing it into place. Before grinding made parts truly interchangeable, a fitter with a file was a necessary part of building every engine, hand-working each component until it seated. That craft was slow, and it did not scale. Ford's line could not wait for it. Grinding was what delivered that. In 1906, Ford ordered 13 Landis grinders at once, and the trade journals took notice. There is a small detail from those early automotive jobs that tells you everything about how this company solved problems. The heat of the heavy Ford production was warping the finished parts, so the Landis men ran water straight onto the point where the wheel met the steel to carry the heat away. The first coolant rig on some of those machines was a garden hose, aimed by hand. Within a generation, that fix had become an industry standard. By the 1920s, there was hardly an automobile plant in Detroit or in Europe that did not have Landis grinders somewhere in its engine line. The company advertised its crank grinders as indispensable to the automobile builders, machines that could grind the pins absolutely round, and it kept agents standing by in London, Cologne, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Barcelona, and as far away as Yokohama. The brothers who had sold 6 machines in a single year were now quietly equipping the factories that were putting the entire world on wheels. The crank pin grinder had become the beating heart of the American engine plant. That kind of capacity does not stay civilian for long. A country cannot build weapons without the machines that grind the steel, and when war came to Europe in 1914, the American machine tool industry found itself with customers on both sides of the ocean and both sides of the trenches. Landis was part of that trade. The same grinders that finished crankshafts could finish the components of arms, and in the years before the United States entered the war, American toolmakers sold into the conflict freely and profitably. It earned the whole industry a nickname it did not enjoy: the Merchants of Death. It was the first time Waynesboro had to reckon with the fact that the precision it was so proud of did not much care what it was pointed at. It would not be the last. When the reckoning came a second time, the country had stopped arguing about it. In the Second World War, there was no Merchants of Death debate. There was only the emergency, and the machine tool industry was the part of American industry that armed everything else. By the peak of the war, the Landis Tool Company ranked among the 25 largest machine tool builders in the United States. The Waynesboro plant ran around the clock. Men and women worked shift after shift, grinding the crankshafts that went into aircraft engines and the hardened components that went into military trucks and armor, and the whole town understood exactly what its work was for. A single Landis crank grinder installed in an aircraft engine plant might turn out finished parts for thousands of engines. The company was no longer only building the modern world, it was helping to defend it. The company leaned into it. Landis printed a war production edition of its in-house bulletin, tying the daily grind of the shop floor directly to the men fighting overseas, telling a machinist standing at a grinder in Pennsylvania that the tolerance he held that afternoon might be the difference for a pilot he would never meet. For the generation that lived it, building cam and crank grinders for the war was a point of fierce local pride, the kind that gets passed down at kitchen tables for 50 years. Fathers who ground engine parts for the war would have sons who ground them for peace, and grandsons after that. In Waynesboro, working at Landis was not a job you took. It was one you inherited. The peace brought a different kind of expansion. In 1958, Landis looked across the Atlantic and bought a respected English grinder maker in the Yorkshire town of Keighley, a firm that traded under the name Pressemax. Rebranded as Landis Lund, the English plant gave the company a foothold in the recovering European car industry. It would turn out to be the most important thing Landis owned, though nobody could have guessed it in 1958, because the future of the trade was about to move from iron and oil to something the founders would not have recognized. That inheritance, the family pride, and the town's sense that this factory belonged to it, is what made the next chapter feel like a betrayal, because the ownership of the company was about to leave Waynesboro entirely. In 1968, the whole Landis operation was absorbed by Litton Industries, a sprawling conglomerate run out of Beverly Hills, California, the kind of company that bought machine tool builders the way other men bought stocks. The people who now owned the factory had never heard the whistle, never known the families, never stood on the floor while a bed was being scraped. To Litton, Landis was a line on a balance sheet. The whistle still blew over Waynesboro every morning. It simply no longer belonged to anyone who could hear it. The workers organized. In 1969, the machinists brought in the Teamsters, and what followed was years of grinding conflict between a local workforce and a distant corporate parent that did not want to bargain. There were strikes through the middle of the 1970s. And then the fight produced one of the strangest episodes in the company's entire history, one that ended up in a federal courtroom. When the Waynesboro workers struck, management kept the orders moving by having grinders built overseas through the company's own foreign licensees and shipping them into the American market to fill contracts the striking hands would otherwise have filled. Then, in a twist worthy of the drama it caused, Landis turned around and sued to block a set of automatic crankpin grinders that a British firm had built and sold to the Ford Motor Company, claiming the British machines infringed a Landis patent. The case went to the United States International Trade Commission, and in December of 1979, it handed down a verdict that captured the whole bind the American machine tool industry was in. The commission agreed the patent had been infringed, and then, for the first time in its history, it refused to do anything about it. Ford argued that it needed those grinders to build the more efficient engines the federal government was now demanding, and that Landis could not deliver replacements before the patent ran out anyway. The public interest, the commission ruled, was better served by leaving the foreign machines in the Ford plant than by protecting an American patent. The company that had helped arm the arsenal of democracy had just been told by its own government that the country needed a foreign grinder more than it needed a Landis. That was 1979. It was a sign of everything that was coming. And yet, even as the American plant was fighting for its life, the English arm the company had bought back in 1958 was about to make history. For 100 years, a cam grinder had needed a physical master, a metal template of the exact lobe shape that the machine traced the way a locksmith traces a key. Change the engine's valve timing, and you had to machine a whole new set of masters, a job that took weeks and cost a fortune. In 1983, Landis Lund built the world's first production grinding machine that threw the physical master away and replaced it with a computer. The lobe shape now lived as numbers in software. An automaker could redraw a camshaft profile and load it into the machine in the time it used to take to carry the old masters down to the shop. It was the leap from the mechanical age to the digital one made by a Landis plant, and it kept the name at the front of the trade for another generation. A decade later, the same plant built the first twin-wheel version. Camshaft design had been frozen for decades by the sheer cost of cutting new masters. Now, an engineer could try a new valve timing on a Friday and grind it the following week, and the pace of engine development quickened because of a machine built in a Yorkshire town most Americans could not find on a map. Whatever was happening to the company on paper, the engineering was still the best in the world. But engineering was no longer what decided the company's fate. Ownership was. Through the 1980s, the American machine tool industry was gutted. Cheaper, heavily subsidized machines poured in from Japan, and the great old American builders, the names that had armed 2 world wars and put the country on wheels, went under one after another. Bullard, Kearney and Trecker, Warner and Swayze. The roll call of the dead read like a history of American manufacturing itself. These were not weak companies that deserved to fail. They were companies that had been out-financed by a national industrial strategy on the other side of the world, and one by one, the lights went out in their plants. Landis did not go under. It survived because it had spent a century burrowing into one narrow, unglamorous corner of the trade, automotive engine grinding, and holding it so tightly that Detroit was nervous about buying those machines anywhere else. But surviving is not the same as thriving, and in the new order, Landis was no longer a company so much as a property. It became a parcel, passed from one corporate owner to the next. When Litton restructured, the industrial businesses were folded into a company called Western Atlas in 1994. 3 years later, they were spun out again into a firm called Unova. Each new owner inherited the machines, the patents, the name, and the workforce, and each new owner was a little further removed from the town that had built all of it. The machines were still wanted. The company was just no longer anyone's home. It was an asset. And assets get moved. In December of 2005, the Landis grinding business was sold one more time to a French industrial group based in Paris called Fives, which folded the American operation into a division and renamed it. By then, Landis was still the largest builder of crankshaft and camshaft grinding machines in the world, a company with the leading share of a global market, and on paper that made it a prize. But the prize and the plant were no longer the same thing. A modern owner could keep the name and the technology and the customer list, and build the machines somewhere cheaper, closer, more convenient. The engineering was portable. The town was not. 3 years after the sale, in 2008, the new owners made the decision the town had spent 111 years dreading. To modernize its operations and tighten its supply chain, Fives closed the Waynesboro plant. The historic brick complex, the one built on the ashes of the 1897 fire, the one the citizens of Waynesboro had reached into their own pockets to raise, was shut down for good. Operations moved to a smaller, modern facility across the state line in Hagerstown, Maryland. The distance was not far in miles. In every way that mattered to Waynesboro, it was the end of the world. Hundreds of jobs went with it, and they were not ordinary jobs. They were the jobs a grandfather had worked, and a father, and a son, in the same buildings, holding the same tolerances, listening for the same whistle that had called men to their shifts since before anyone alive could remember. When the plant went quiet, it took a piece of the town's identity with it. The steam whistle that had marked the rhythm of the town's entire working life fell silent, and the sound of it slid into memory. The kind of memory the people who grew up with it would one day find themselves straining to hear again. They decided not to let it disappear. During the town's bicentennial, residents had begun gathering up the artifacts of the industrial past that had defined them, and out of that effort came the Waynesboro Industrial Museum, which opened at the turn of the millennium. Inside it sit the paper blueprints and the cast-iron beds and the machinists' toolboxes, the physical record of what these hands built. And in a place of honor sits the original steam whistle from the Landis Tool Factory, the one that once told a whole town when to work and when to rest, kept now so the sound is not lost entirely. School children file past the old grinders the way earlier generations once passed them on the factory floor, except these machines are silent now. The museum does not pretend the loss did not happen. It simply refuses to let the achievement be buried alongside it. What Waynesboro built mattered, and the people who built it deserve to be remembered as more than a footnote in some conglomerate's annual report. Franklin and Abraham Landis were both inducted, after their deaths, into the Machine Tool Hall of Fame, their names set alongside the founders of the American manufacturing tradition, honored for the grinders that made mass production possible. And the company itself did not die. Under the Fives name, Landis grinders are still built today, in Maryland and in England, still holding the same impossible tolerances, still near the front of a trade the brothers helped invent. The names bolted to the machines have changed a dozen times. The precision has not. Somewhere right now, on a modern engine line, a crankshaft is being ground true on a machine whose lineage runs straight back to a wooden shop that burned down in 1897. The Landis Tool Company was never famous the way the automakers it supplied were famous. Almost no one who ever drove a Ford or a Buick knew that the roundness of the crankshaft turning under the hood had been ground true on a machine from a small town in Pennsylvania. But the modern world is built on invisible precision, on the tolerances nobody sees and everybody depends on. Landis spent a century holding those tolerances, from a garden hose aimed at a grinding wheel to a computer that made a metal master obsolete. The town that saved the company in 4 days understood something the conglomerates that came later never did. Some things are worth reaching into your own pocket to keep. If this is the kind of story you want more of, there is another one waiting for you on screen right now. Go watch it. See you there.